Hey everybody, welcome to another video, and today we're going to be taking a look at 5 EV charging companies just to see how likely it would be for any one of these companies to end up getting acquired sometime soon. I've been looking forward to making this video because there's an interesting correlation between Volta's book value and the price that Shell is acquiring Volta for. So we're going to be taking a look at the book value mainly for each of these 5 companies. It's not going to be anything too in-depth today. I just kind of want to highlight this correlation and then sort of take a look at 5 other companies just to see where they stand in this regard. So for anybody that's unfamiliar with this Shell and Volta acquisition, it's going through at a price of $169 million. And the interesting thing about that is that it's right in line with what Volta's book value is these days. If you take a look at Volta's total assets being $369 million, and their total liabilities being $203 million, and you subtract those liabilities from those assets, then you get what's called their book value. In Volta's case, their book value is $166.2 million, which is, right in line with that $169 million price that Shell is acquiring the company for. So I thought this was a pretty interesting correlation here. Obviously, there's other factors beyond the book value that go into, a company's valuation. But for a company like Volta, which was a company that was really struggling financially and had pretty much run out of cash, you can see Volta at one point had hundreds of millions of dollars of cash on their balance sheet. But as they continued to grow their business, building new chargers and paying salaries, all of these expenses related to growing their business, they quickly ended up running out of cash. And, as of September 30th last year, only reported $15.6 million. So since Volta was struggling financially here, and they were really kind of frozen, they weren't really able to do any more because they just didn't have enough cash to do anything, an acquisition was really a high probability for Volta and was pretty much the best move for the company. Now moving on to the first company that we're going to be looking at, this is going to be Tritium DCFC. They manufacture DC fast charging hardware. They don't own their stations like Volta does, they simply sell it. A very similar business model to ChargePoint, for example. Now, since Tritium doesn't own their chargers, they don't have a lot in their property, plant, and equipment line. Only $11.1 million there, which is not that much to the total assets that they have of $213 million. Now, going back to Volta's balance sheet, for example, you can see that it's quite a lot different for them because they own their chargers. So Volta's property and equipment line is $202 million. And then tying into that is the operating lease right of use assets, which are at $95 million for Volta. These are, the land that Volta has leased out for their chargers to go on. Going back to Tritium, though, they do have quite a lot of total assets, but a lot of that is cash, which of course is good because you need cash to continue growing their business. But, as they do grow their business and use more cash, that's going to eventually disappear, essentially, unless they end up continuing to get more funding. Now, Tritium's in a decent enough position right now with their funding, but if this recession continues to get worse, for example, Tritium won't be able to access as much funding as easily or cheaply as they have previously. So this is ultimately my concern with a lot of these EV charging companies, is just their access to funding. Now, moving on to calculate Tritium's book value, if you subtract their total liabilities of $253.9 million from their total assets of $213 million, you can see that that's actually a negative book value of $40.5 million. So with a negative $40 million book value, it seems like Tritium might not be the most attractive company to acquire at the moment. Now, if you've seen Tritium stock, you'll see that they're worth over $300 million today, so the book value is certainly not the only factor involved here. But in a hypothetical scenario where Tritium was totally out of funds and needed an acquisition to happen for their business to continue, similar to what happened with Volta, then I don't think Tritium would be that attractive of an acquisition. Volta had a positive book value of like $166 million, whereas Tritium here, they've got a negative book value at the moment. Now, looking at EVgo's balance sheet, you'll see they're in a very similar situation to Volta, with $264 million of property and equipment and software, and then $44.5 million of operating lease right of use assets. So very similar to Volta. If they didn't have $300 million of cash, just like Volta, these would be making up almost all of their total assets. So this is kind of a situation between a lot of these companies that own their chargers, is that A lot of their value is tied up in those chargers themselves. Now, all of those assets together give EVgo total assets of $729 million, and then their total liabilities are at $213 million. So subtracting those from their total assets gives EVgo a book value of $516 million. Now, I think EVgo highlights the drawbacks of using solely the book value to determine the valuation of a company. If you take a look at Volta and why this was sort of working for them, it's because their growth was pretty much non-existent at this point. They were totally out of cash and weren't getting any new funding, so Volta was pretty much unable to grow their business. So it really came down to their book value because there was just not a lot of expectations of future growth for Volta as it stood. Now, on the other hand, EVgo has $300 million of cash that they can use to continue growing their business and increasing their revenues. And then, hopefully they can make things more efficient and get better margins, etc. So EVgo still has a long way to go until they're in this dire financial situation like Volta was. So this is just why kind of the book value is not that applicable here for EVgo, in determining what this company is worth. Now, moving on to BLNK, they've kind of got a mixture of those previous two business models we just talked about. So BLNK sells some of their hardware directly to customers who go in to own them, but then they sometimes will own their chargers themselves as well. BLNK has total assets of $360.9 million, and then they've got total liabilities of $91.4 million. So subtracting those liabilities from those assets gives BLNK a book value of $269.5 million. When this report was made, BLNK had $57 million on their balance sheet. Now, you'll notice that that's quite a lot less than what they had back on December 31st, 2021. So, just like all of these EV charging companies, they are losing the amount of cash on their balance sheet. So if BLNK doesn't raise funds sometime in the near future, they might end up in a situation similar to Volta where they're just kind of unable to grow their business because they just don't have enough cash to do it. Now, if that scenario were to play out, BLNK's book value would probably be a bit less than where it's at today, because if they were running out of cash, then they would obviously not have this $57 million of cash that's going towards their book value as it stands right now. Now, the final company we're going to be going over here is ChargePoint. You can see that they've got total assets of just over $1 billion and then total liabilities of $662 million. So if you subtract those liabilities from those assets, you'll see that ChargePoint has a book value of $338.6 million. So pretty solid, for ChargePoint here. They've got a lot of value here in cash as well as short-term investments. So compared to some of these other EV charging companies, I think ChargePoint is in a pretty good spot to continue growing their business. So similarly to EVgo, you just can't really use the book value to determine what ChargePoint's valuation should be. Just going off of the cash and short-term investments here, you can see that ChargePoint has quite a ways to go before they would run out of cash and not be able to grow their business anymore. Now, for anybody interested in knowing what would happen to your shares if an acquisition were to go through, I've got a video on that you can check out. I do go into the Volta and Shell acquisition for anybody interested in that. So be sure to check that video out, and I'll see all of you in the next video.